Hey, everybody. Welcome to my first official podcast. I had made a short introduction podcast, but I more considered that to be just an introduction. But hello, welcome to my humble abode. This is both my office, my bedroom, my sanctuary, and everything in between. And so, what I want to start with is by just talking um, to the caregivers, to the parents, and to anybody who is trying to heal while continuing to show up for other people in whatever capacity that may look for. But for myself, it comes in ways of being a parent, and it's being a parent who's trying to raise emotionally intelligent and emotionally literate children. And if you haven't yet, I've been writing a lot on language. So if you haven't read my Substack letters or my blog, head on over. Head on over to the Substack letters first. I do voiceovers there, so if you don't have time to read, you can definitely listen while you go about your day. Um, but the topics here have been about language and about language, emotional intelligence, and emotional literacy that comes with using that language. And here's the thing is that one of the things I think we don't realize is that, we are doing this, a lot of us are doing this healing while never having been taught or given the language to do it. And so that's who I'm hoping to reach out to here. So if that is you, hi, welcome. Let me first just say that you're not behind. You're not failing. You're doing something profoundly difficult, because what you're doing is you're learning while you're teaching. You are caring while you're healing. And for those of you out there with children, you are parenting while parenting your own inner child. And honestly, that may be some of the hardest and most courageous work that we do in this lifetime. So if you're listening to this and you feel a little tender about it already, that makes sense. But I want to say this much: you're in the right place. This is the conversations that we are going to have. And so you don't have to heal alone. You don't have to learn the language alone. We can all come together here and practice learning the language, and then figuring out how we can go on and teach the language, how we can go on and teach our children the language and retrain ourselves. And in some ways, even retrain our relationships with other people so that it becomes more fluent for everybody. So my episodes here, I want them to be a little bit more like a coffee chat style. So if you have a cup of coffee, cheers. I'm not here to lecture, despite, so for those who don't know, I am a university instructor. I teach at a small university out of Iowa. My focus, the program that I teach in and that I oversee as program director is a bachelor's degree in Ayurvedic wellness and integrative health. My background is my undergraduate degrees in psychology. I worked for many years as a suicide prevention crisis intervention counselor for the state of Vermont. Basically, I answered the suicide hotline for the National Guard. So I was taking care of soldiers and their families through crisis. I was also in the military for 11 years, and while I was in the military, I was a sexual assault victims advocate, and did a lot of things with families to raise morale, especially during high deployment times, which I was in during the early 2000s. And so, for those who remember, it was right at the peak, like right at the height of Operation Iraqi Freedom and Operation Enduring Freedom. After a lot of life stuff that I'm not going to go into here, I ended up getting a graduate degree in master's degree in integrative medicine. And now I'm working on my PhD, which hopefully should be done by the end of this year. I'm getting a PhD in physiology and health. And so I could lecture, but I'm not going to. That's not the purpose of this podcast. The purpose of this podcast is really just to slow down and talk about what happens when we have some really deep emotions, and we may also have some deep emotional wounds, but we don't have the language for them. And so some of the things that I have noticed in my studies, so my particular area of focus is my dissertation is on women with PTSD. And some of the things that I have realized is that in studying that, is that, PTSD isn't just showing up as fear, right? It's not showing up in the typical ways that we think of PTSD. A lot of people think of PTSD and we think of the combat soldiers who come back and they jump at every loud sound or every bang, and the soldier who has like the 1,000-yard stare as they're kind of lost in their thoughts. Those are very stereotypical ways that PTSD show up. But in my research, what I have found is that there's subclusters of PTSD, which we do check for in through the DSM-5. And some of those things are things like dissociation, avoidance. There is fear. There's some cognitive and processing issues as well. But what I have found is that a lot of what it boils down to is that ability to talk about what happened and the ability to say, this is how I'm feeling. And so one of the models that I'm starting to come up with is this idea behind language, awareness, and action. Because in the work that I've done, it's not so much about just looking back at the past and trying to unwind it all. It's about understanding the past so that we can understand our present self, so that we can make a better version of ourselves in the future. And so I'm starting this podcast, and I started this Substack so that I could start to talk about these things in a more relatable way, instead of in a research-driven way, which is typically very boring and not necessarily accessible to everyday people. And so I want to do that by sharing some of my own stories, inviting people here later at some point to share their stories, and to have a conversation about what these things look like, because so many of us are going and living our day-to-day lives with complex PTSD. You might notice CPTSD, with anxiety, with depression, and with some really deep emotional wounds that we simply don't know how to talk about. And for many of us, we may even be tired of talking about them. Like, because I know for myself, years and years of therapy, and the therapy was helpful. It was helpful to be heard, to be seen, and to be validated in that moment. But I needed more. I needed more, especially after my daughter was born. I needed to be able to say, that is where I was, here is where I am, and I'm going to heal so that I can raise a child who does not need to heal from their childhood. And so here's the thing, is I think it gives shape to what so many of us are carrying. So that is why I'm here. Uh, and I want to invite you, if you are interested in this conversation, grab your cup of coffee, let me know. And I would love to have you on the podcast. I would love to have you come chat. So I want to talk a bit about the emotional climate that I grew up in. Because here's the interesting part is oftentimes when I look back, some of my earliest lessons about emotions and about what we were allowed to say about those emotions, they weren't they weren't lessons on expression. They were lessons on suppression and survival. And so here's the thing: is I learned very young that suppression was easier than speaking. It was modeled for me. Right. So, um, going quiet was far safer than saying what I felt, because it would do one of two things. It would either evoke anger, and that anger would then be explosive and would physically hurt, or it would be met with an odd type of indifference. An indifference that said, I don't know what to do because I can't fix this for you. I can't change this for you. And I'm not, and there was also a slight unwillingness to change because of the other problems that it would create, the financial difficulties it would create, and the instability that would come with it. And so it was just easier. It was just, I learned early on, it was just easier to just mum's the word. Disappearing caused less damage than taking up any kind of space, whether it be physically or emotionally. And now as an adult who's raising a child, I see something that I couldn't see back then. A lot of it wasn't about being too sensitive, or too emotional. Or for me in particular, it wasn't about being too loud, and too opinionated. I got that a lot. Sorry for the sniffling, seasonal allergies. So it wasn't about me being these things. It was really about the adults around me who simply they didn't have language for their own inner worlds. They were dealing with some very complicated emotions, some very complicated narratives inside themselves that made it difficult for them to show up for me or my siblings in a way that we needed. So I grew up. My parents separated when I was very young. My mom did end up getting remarried. She's actually been remarried twice, and so at the time, my stepfather, my first stepfather, here's the thing: is there was this weird duality to him. There are some memories where I remember that he was just so fun and he could be so happy, and I can remember laughing, but then one thing would happen and it would switch. Like literally somebody flipped a switch and then he would become explosive. And the thing is that he has lived almost entirely inside his anger. And as a child, really all I knew was fear and unpredictability. So while I had that happy side, I knew in the back of my mind that that was only for so long. Only for so long. And, because here's the thing is, even as a child, you don't necessarily have the words or the perspective to say that that's dysregulation, because that's what it was. You just know that deep down that person is not safe. And so now that I'm older, um, you know, and with some distance as well, I moved out as soon as I graduated high school, joined the military. So with some distance, I can see what likely lived underneath his anger. And I kind of talk about this in my Substack letter. My stepdad came from a very large family. They did not have a lot. His survival really was on him, and it was way too early. Way too early. He was made to fend for himself, I think, before he was ready. And here's the thing: is that when your childhood requires that kind of emotional hardening, especially in the areas that he lived right outside of a major city, um, in a poor part of the neighborhood. That often produces adults whose nervous system never learned how to settle. And it's horribly dysregulating. And anger is, it can get you what you want in that time, right? So when you're angry and you lash out at somebody, you get angry at them, you attack them, you scare them, you can get what you need in that moment. And so anger becomes this learned response to this horribly dysregulated nervous system. And so that's where he lived. That's where he lived. He knew that he could get the responses that he needed in that moment, if he just exploded. And then there was the other side of things. There was my mom. Now, my mom was deeply nurturing when it came to us kids. To be honest with you, I thank my mom for my ability to nurture my child the way I have, because she really modeled that aspect of parenting and motherhood for me. She was attentive. Um, she was loving. She was very fair. We never felt like she had a favorite, ever. And she really poured herself into motherhood. And, a lot of that I recognize now is, she was giving us things that she did not have as a child. And she has said that as much as well. My mom has said that, every birthday for us, no matter how little we had. I remember the one thing I loved was every birthday for us was the same. We would get to pick out color themes, and we would get to go to Walmart, and we'd get to pick out our cake that would match the color theme, and we would get to pick out streamers and balloons and a couple of other decorations so we could decorate the inside of our trailer with the color themes that we wanted. And so, every birthday party we would come home, and the dining room area in this really small trailer that we lived in, it would always be decorated, and it would be so bright, and it would be so festive. And she did those things because she didn't get that when she was a kid. She didn't get the birthday parties. She had, at one point, had been gifted a firearm, because her, growing up, our family, we lived in rural Missouri, right? So the big thing for us was deer hunting, turkey hunting. My grandfather even went and hunted rabbits and raccoons and possums. Like, if you can hunt it, we hunted it. Fishing, the whole nine. And so, even at one point, my mom remembers getting gifted a firearm from my grandfather, and he took it away and gave it to her brother. So even gifts weren't necessarily hers. And so that was one thing I know that my mom did, because again, she did not get that as a kid. And so a lot of, I think, what she was doing for us at that time was to really heal herself as a child as well. But here's the problem though, there was another layer to my mom as well. And it was, to be honest with you, hi, Mom. I know we're going to probably talk about this later if she hears this. It was her pattern with men. You know, my grandfather, I remember my grandfather fondly. My grandfather would take us for rides on the tractor. He got me my first fishing pole, would take me fishing down at the pond. I remember my earliest and most favorite memories of my grandfather were riding in his pickup truck into town to go to the local like farm store where they sold like, you know, like feed and like farm supplies, but they also had bait. And so we would go pick up chicken livers and worms and Mountain Dew. And then we go home. We would fish early in the morning. And then right around lunchtime, he would pack me back up in the truck. And then we would go back in. And there was this little restaurant called the Chuck Wagon. And we would get a hamburger or a hot dog. And we'd always end it with root beer float. So my grandfather had ways of like showing, he would provide. But the one thing I can honestly say is I don't ever remember my grandfather saying, I love you. My grandfather never really truly expressed his emotion. He definitely did not have the language, like actual language words for his feelings, but the way that he did show that he cared was through provision. He would provide what we needed in that moment. It was why we had a place to live. You know, it's why the trailer I grew up in was, it was because of my grandfather. We had that place to live. Oftentimes it was if we needed a winter coat, the reason we had a winter coat was because my grandfather would buy it. And so, but here's the thing is it really created this complicated and sometimes painful pattern with men in her life, because I think sometimes that, and the way that I understand it is that there was this kind of trying to recreate versions of her own father, of my grandfather. Men who showed love through provision rather than emotional presence, and men who were often volatile or distant. Men who left her carrying the emotional weight of the household alone. And that was, you know, I've seen kind of that recurring pattern in the men, in my biological father, in my first stepfather, and even in my current stepfather now. And so the thing was is that when these men would inevitably become explosive, my mom was not one to confront it or try to figure out how to repair it. You know, she instead collapsed. So, you know, there were a lot of times where a fight would break out. And my mom, you know, my stepdad would go into the living room, light a cigarette, and leave the mess. And then my mom would go to the other end of the house to the bedroom, and she would cry, retreat back there, and then just wait for the tension to pass. And then once that storm was over, everything just returned to normal. Quiet. Nothing was discussed. There was no processing. There was no repair. It just like it never happened. The rupture simply disappeared without conversation. So those are some of my earliest lessons. It was, you know, anger is explosive, sadness, you just withdraw. And then if you stay quiet, that's how you restore order. And don't talk about what just happened. And in a lot of ways, it's still that way. It's still very much that way. And that's something I think is honestly has been passed down through many generations. You don't air the dirty laundry. You don't talk about it. And here's where I want to pause. Here's why I want to pause, because if this feels familiar to you, I want to say this: you're not alone. I think that a lot of households functioned this way. And I think in a lot of ways today, they still function this way. And it wasn't, and I want to be very clear about this, it's not because our parents didn't care, for the most part, right? I'm sure there's some parents out there. But for the most part, it's not because our parents didn't care. It's just because they didn't have the tools, they didn't have the language. And here's the thing, without language, our nervous system becomes the messenger. And so I would love to hear from you if this felt familiar to you in any way. Because I think it's important to first realize, like, hey, I'm not alone in this. So if you're not, if you resonate it, you're not alone. I'm going to raise my cup here and say, cheers. The interesting part about this was that I know for me, it was growing up without the language being modeled for me. Growing up in that way is it wasn't that the problem was that we felt too much. It was that for a lot of us, we were feeling this deeply. We saw what was going on. And we just were never given a way to translate how we were feeling into anything that was usable. And so our emotions arised, right? They showed up, but they didn't have language. They didn't have anything to give them meaning. And so when that happens, they aren't able to move through the body like they're supposed to. Okay, emotions are supposed to kind of move through us. We're supposed to feel them. The wave comes in, we feel the emotion, but just like a wave, it's supposed to flow back out. But for so many of us, because we didn't understand what was going on, the wave never truly subsided. Instead, it settled in and it took root. And then it started to blur the edges, right? It started to blur the edges of how we feel and who we are. And so I want to make a distinction here. When we talk in this space, I want to make a distinction here that there's a difference between I feel insert emotion. So I feel angry and I am angry. Okay. I feel is an experience. It's something that you can just witness. It's something you can name. And then from there you can work with it. Okay. But I am an identity. All right. And so psychologically and even neurologically, telling our nervous system, the difference between this is something I'm experiencing to something that this is something that I identify as, that difference is enormous. Because that's what keeps our nervous system in this state of being activated. Because when it becomes part of our identity, that emotion is not able to flow back out. It just keeps looping. And then the longer that it loops, the harder it becomes to just set back and ask what it's trying to communicate. Because by then it's become so complicated, it's become so layered. And this is where therapy really comes in handy. So I don't want to understate the importance of therapy in this moment, because when we get to that point, that's where we need to have a moment to sit down and just really take that tangled ball of yarn, right, and start to pull it apart so that we can better understand it. But this is why we often feel lost inside of our emotions. And it's not because the emotion itself is wrong. No, the emotion was doing what it needed to do. It was trying to give us a message. But the problem is that there was, after a while, there was nothing standing between the emotion and ourselves. Okay. Language is that buffer. Language is that buffer of the feeling being an experience. I'm feeling this way. But without that buffer, without that language, the emotion becomes everything. It becomes the whole room. Okay? And here's the thing is a lot of times, um, people avoid labeling it because when we name something, it makes it feel bigger than them. And then when we name something, all of a sudden now we've defined it. And then now that it's defined, now we feel like, well, we have to justify it or we have to fix it, or we have to find some way to control it. At least that's what we've been taught, right? So many cultures, especially, to be honest, being raised in the church, really kind of solidified that thought is that man was given dominion over all the things and he named all the things. And so this idea of like, I named it, so it's mine, that gets scary. That gets really scary when you're feeling something you don't understand and you're like, I don't want to own this. Like, I don't want dominion over this. And so the idea then becomes like, hey, if I don't label it, then is it really mine to deal with? And if I don't put words to it, does it really count? Or, maybe if I don't define this thing, then it's not going to demand anything from me. I won't actually have to do anything with it. But here's the problem with that. When the emotion goes unnamed, it doesn't stop existing. It's still there, it's still real. Instead, it moves into the body. And whenever it moves into the body, it settles into our nervous system, and then it becomes reactivity. We react to everything. And after a while, it becomes exhaustion. We get fatigued. And here's the thing is it shows up in our body. How many of us who have gone through these really complicated emotions find ourselves dealing with anxiety, dealing with depression, dealing with burnout? How many of you all, and I'm going to raise my hand on this one, okay, so put a finger down if you have stomach issues. Put a finger down if you have headaches. Put a finger down if you have muscle tension. Put a finger down if you have insomnia. Put a finger down if you suffer from inflammation. Okay, the list could keep going and going. But here's the thing is where all that starts from is stress. And that stress often stems from a lot of these unresolved and unprocessed emotions that we're feeling. So here's the thing is that naming it doesn't mean that you have to claim it. Okay. Naming it is not saying this is who I am. Again, there is a difference. So when we're naming it, we're not saying I am this. Instead, naming it is just saying, this is the experience. This is how I feel. This is what is happening. Okay. And that becomes a regulatory act. That becomes a regulatory act because when you can just say, this is something that I'm experiencing, it now becomes outside of you. It creates some distance for you so that you can take a step back and you can look at it. And then from that point, you get to choose. You get to choose what you want to do with it. And it becomes so much easier than to work with it. And here's the thing is, for myself, again, as I tell my students, I'm my own best example. For me, a lot of this work, I avoid it for the better part of my early adulthood. I didn't want anything to do with it. But the moment I became a parent, I realized I didn't have a choice anymore. Because here's the thing is like parenting is this relentless mirror. It doesn't just bring up how much patience you have or how much stress you can withstand. It brings up a lot of things that you realize you never got. And for me, sadly for me, my childhood and my formative years, my teen years were really marked by a lot of different types of abuse. Um, and for myself, and again, I think for a lot of people, we didn't ask our question about like, well, what's wrong with the people who are hurting me? Instead we tend to again internalize it. We take away that distance and we internalize it and saying, what's wrong with me? Here's the thing, I carried that question for a really long time. In becoming a parent and looking at my child and thinking about all the things that they would inevitably do that was going to inevitably piss me off, which they do, right? The rules that they were going to break and the silly things that they were going to do. But the one thing I realized staring at that child, even to this day, looking at my teenager, is I realized that they weren't doing it because there was anything wrong with them. And my reaction to what they were doing wasn't because anything was wrong with them. And it made me think, if there's nothing wrong with them, then was there ever anything wrong with me? My perspective started to shift a lot. And I realized that if I wanted to offer my child what I had honestly never received, then I was going to have to heal in ways that they were never modeled for me. And so that raises questions that I think a lot of people do eventually ask. And that's, how do you start a process like healing when you've never been taught how to do it? And I'm going to be honest with you here, because that is a question that I do get asked a lot in my coaching sessions. People often look at me as their coach thinking I'm going to just prescribe them the magical cure. I'm going to have the answer in my hand. But here's the problem, is that it looks different for everyone. So there's no blueprint. So I do want to pause here and kind of put a caveat in saying, I don't have a magical answer. I don't have a cure for what's going on. But here is one thing that I have found to be consistently true. And that's that we have to parent our own inner child with the same care that we offer our actual children. We have to give ourselves what we lacked. And again, that looks different for everybody. And how we show up for ourselves how you show up for yourself is going to look a lot different than how I show up for myself. But that's where we start, because we have to identify what was denied. And from there, we have to give it to ourselves. And I know for me, it was my voice. And it's one of the reasons I started writing last year. Because it offered me a chance to use my voice. In the first time in 41 years of my life, I finally have found a way to use my voice. And so even if I am speaking out into the void, if nobody ever watches this podcast or listens to me in any way, I'm using my voice. I'm giving myself what I've always needed. And so, I want to invite you here to start thinking, about what your inner child needs. What didn't you receive? What kind of expression was shut down for you when you were younger? And then how are you going to be able to offer yourself that now in healthy and supportive ways? And here's the thing, is you don't have to answer it perfectly. You don't even have to solve it today. But just allowing that question to land, allowing that question to kind of be planted, is how your healing begins. And so I've been here for about 40 minutes now. And so I do want to start closing up, and I want to start I want to close up by starting with this and just saying, I want to say this as clearly as possible. Okay. What you feel about your past, whatever it is that you have survived, however you feel about what has been done to you, what you feel is valid. Emotions are not random. Emotions exist for a reason. And here's the thing is that what you're feeling comes with a message. Your emotions are trying to tell you something. And so my hope in this podcast, my hope in my Substack letters, my hopes in my blog, my hopes in my books, all of it, my hope is that you find a safe place, both within yourself as well as with others, so that you can explore what your emotions are asking for. Because here's the thing, that's how healing happens. That's how that's how our generation is going to heal. I say generation, I'm an 80s baby, 90s kid, older millennial, born in the 1900s, as my daughter puts it. But this is how our generation is going to do the work differently. This is how we're going to start to interrupt cycles that have been repeated for many, many generations. Many generations have lived this way, and I think our generation and this time is going to be vastly different. And so, this is how we become the adults that we needed. And so I just want to say, you don't have to do this perfectly. All you need to do is show up. Just show up. That is the first and most important step. And when you do the work, just do it honestly, even if that honesty is a little bit uncomfortable, disconcerting. Just look at it honestly, with some kindness and some curiosity. And I do want to say, if you are comfortable, I would love to hear from you. I would love to see you in my comment section. I would love to have you on the podcast. I'll figure out how that works. I would love to have a chat with you, to allow you to share your story and to allow you to a space where you can be heard. And I especially want to do that for my fellow parents who are trying to learn the language of our inner landscape and our emotions now, while you're trying to teach your kids to do the same thing. So I want to thank you so much for following along. And I do want to invite you, if you haven't yet, I would love for you to hit all the buttons. Please hit all the buttons. Hit that like, hit the follow, please subscribe to my channel here. Check out my Substack letter. Go read the blog. I also have a bunch of other things that are available. I have books. I've got a lot of things out there, but I would love to connect and hear from you. So until next week, well, I think I'm going to actually do this every other week. So I will see you in a couple of weeks, so that we can continue with this discussion about language. But for now, it was great talking to you. Thank you so much for joining me on this first episode. And I will see you around Substack. Bye.